In this video, I want to pick up on some of the methodology that we talked about in the prior video dealing with the first quadrant plane and the line of equality, that dashed line that runs through the middle of that. And that is that any value that lies on that dashed line represents equivalent values on either axis. And so that is the line of equality that runs right to the middle of that particular angle. So in this particular video, we're going to be talking about something called the aggregate expenditures model, which is now really our first effort to build a true model of the macroeconomy. This model derives from the work of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, whose work was then later built on by other economists, and laying out a model of demand throughout the economy. And what the model of demand is really the first effort to explain why business cycles happen, and more importantly, how business cycles can be moderated, particularly through government involvement. So we're going to first of all go with two additional assumptions. And the first assumption is that we're talking about a private economy, and by private we mean private sector, that is households and businesses only, no government involvement. And obviously we'll relax this assumption a bit later. And then the final assumption is a closed economy, and that is that it's an economy without imports and exports. Nothing comes in, nothing leaves. Obviously that, to be more realistic, we'll have to relax that assumption as well. And we'll do that here shortly. So again, just as in the case with consumption, that part of that large component of demand throughout the economy, which is household consumption, there is a point at which, even at zero income, as defined as GDP, because we're talking about the macroeconomy, at zero income, there is some amount of spending that we'll simply refer to as autonomous spending. The only two components of that, since we don't have a government entity at this stage, and there's no imports or exports, is simply consumption and investment. Consumption being household spending, investment being business spending on things like plant and equipment, technology, machines, and things of that nature. And so, just as in the case before where there was dis-savings and savings, the Keynesian model views the fact that there's an equilibrium point at which there is an equivalence between the amount of spending going on in the economy and the amount of income that's being generated. There can be imbalances that are temporary in nature, often due to issues concerning unplanned inventory changes. Remember, changes in inventories are part of the investment equation, so there are occasions in which changes in inventories will result in an out of equilibrium condition. But for the most part, the economy is oftentimes operating at an equilibrium condition. And equilibrium is a very important concept in economics because there are very many instances, both at micro and the macro level, where we can observe an economic system that is more or less in balance at an equilibrium condition. So we're going to assume right now that the economy is in an equilibrium condition, which is simply the case in which there's no unplanned investment primarily. And investment, when we talked about the expenditures approach to GDP calculation, we said that investment was far and away the most volatile element of GDP spending. Not consumption, but rather investment. Because of a lot of different issues concerning things like the rate of change of technology, changes in interest rates, changes in business expectations and outlook, etc. Well, here's where the Keynesian model is actually going. It's basically saying this: okay, we could be operating in equilibrium, and that is basically, by the way, it's a point at which savings equals investment. And the reason for this is there's no change in savings and there's no change in investment. So as a result, since savings fuels investment, the two are considered to be equal at that equilibrium point. But here's the thing, and think about when Keynes was doing this major work, and then which was built upon by subsequent authors, was the point at which he was saying, look, we could be in equilibrium, things are steady, but he referred to a potential point of being below full employment as full employment being out here, and the actual state of the economy being there to the left. And as a result, what we've got is an out of equilibrium condition where we're in equilibrium. I shouldn't say out of equilibrium, we're in equilibrium, but we're operating below full employment. And what Keynes referred to this condition is underemployment equilibrium. So what's the answer? How do we get from here to here? And the answer lies essentially there, where if we were to have a higher level of demand throughout the economy, we could get there. In other words, what would get us to a new level of spending such that we could be at full employment? The main idea of Keynesian economic theory is the idea that depressed economies are as a result of insufficient aggregate demand. And we'll talk more about aggregate demand in subsequent videos, because once we get through this model, it will lend itself and dovetail very nicely with that other model that we'll be focusing on throughout the rest of this course, that of aggregate demand. So what's needed here? What is the missing piece? Well, the missing piece is a broader role for government. And so this difference here is a change in government spending that can then lead to a change in overall demand. So the private economy assumption is now relaxed. So we now have a new level of aggregate expenditures, which is now C plus I plus G, consumption plus investment plus government spending. And this is really the Keynesian cure for an economy that's operating below full employment, is more government spending on whatever kinds of projects that might be applicable, particularly those which add long-term value, additions to the capital stock of the country, things like highways and bridges and canals and things of that nature. This doesn't sound particularly radical today, but in the 1930s it was, because there was a great fear of excessive government spending, particularly government spending that had to be financed by borrowing, which at the time was considered to be pretty radical. A lot of people didn't want to do it. You ran into lots of political resistance. Nonetheless, some of these recommendations were implemented in the United States in the 1930s, and the economy did grow throughout that period, with the exception of a blip around 1937, which was as a result really of sort of letting off the accelerator, frankly, on some of the government spending. But for the most part, the economy did grow and come out of that period. And by the way, this different distance between these 2 points on this axis and this point here can be represented by some multiplier. So if government spending were to be something like $100 million, and let's say the multiplier is 4, then $100 million would be all that would be needed to cure a gap, what we call the output gap, the distance between actual and potential GDP or full employment GDP. So this little star here represents equilibrium, but it also represents actual being less than full employment GDP. And then one final thing which brings this model back into some more focus here is this, and that is, what if we bring in trade and spending with other countries? And so as a result of this, let's excuse me, let's not focus so much on closing the output gap here, but rather what would be the effect of a positive trade balance. And that is the idea that if we now bring into account all the elements of spending, that is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, then we relax the assumption and remove that of the closed economy. And if in fact this is positive, this is a positive term of net exports, then we actually have a boost to GDP. So we move in this direction. If an economy has a positive trade balance, that is exports exceeding imports. And the reason for this is very simple. If your exports exceed your imports for any country, it means that the rest of the world is financing your output and consumption, output and income, greater than what your economy is funding the rest of the world's collectively. So selling goods abroad is considered to be a good thing. On the other hand, if it were a negative, and this value is a negative term, then we would see a drag in the other direction of net exports. And as a result, if you have some sort of negative trade balance, and we have the aggregate expenditures now being C plus I plus G minus X sub N, then we actually have something much lower. And I've sort of overdrawn this a little bit, but the point is that it's lowered, so a negative trade balance results in a decrease in GDP. So the thing to know about this is exports being greater than imports results in what's known as a trade surplus, and the effect on GDP is positive, and so there's an upward movement of GDP. And if it's less, exports are less than imports, then we have a trade deficit. And this is where the United States has been for most of the last 60 years, and it has a drag on GDP. So imports have that effect of bringing down national income. And so the expenditures model is simply one way of viewing the macroeconomy. Some of the shortcomings and the criticisms of this particular model, however, are the fact that it's really a demand-side view only. And because of this, there's no supply-side issue. And that's what we're going to be covering in subsequent videos, is what do we do with this really early development of a macroeconomic model, and how do we put this together with supply in order to arrive at a new and an updated version of what macroeconomic equilibrium looks at. So that's what we'll cover in subsequent videos.